Imagine it's a Friday evening. You're in your own living room, and you're apologizing for something you didn't even do.
Just to keep the peace.
Exactly. Just to end a grueling 3-day silent treatment. You feel exhausted, entirely confused, and somehow completely to blame.
It's a terrible feeling.
It is. The person sitting across from you isn't yelling. They aren't throwing things. Instead, they're, slumped over, sighing heavily, playing the role of the profoundly misunderstood victim.
Right.
At first glance, this seems harmless. It feels like empathy. It looks like fragility. But what if the person sulking on the couch isn't actually hurt at all? What if that extreme sensitivity, that self-doubt, is actually a highly sophisticated weapon?
Which most people completely miss.
Welcome to the debate. Today, we are investigating the hidden, often chilling mechanics of vulnerable or covert narcissism.
It's a dynamic that leaves so many people feeling, honestly, completely untethered from reality.
Completely untethered, and that brings us to the central question we're dissecting today. When a vulnerable narcissist reacts to a minor criticism, say, you suggest a different restaurant for dinner, right?
Sure.
When they react with extreme rage or days of sullen withdrawal, what exactly are we witnessing? I approach this from a behavioral profiling perspective. I look at the power dynamics.
Right.
And from where I sit, we are looking at a calculated manipulation system. It's a behavioral algorithm designed intentionally to maintain interpersonal control, extract psychological resources, and, keep the partner entirely off balance.
And I come at this from a trauma-informed therapeutic perspective. So I see the exact same devastating impact on the partner, but I view the root cause entirely differently.
Okay, how so?
Well, I don't see a mastermind playing a calculated game of chess. I see behaviors that are primitive, profoundly dysregulated defense mechanisms. They are triggered by overwhelming shame and a deeply fractured sense of self.
But the damage is still there.
Oh, the damage they cause is catastrophic, yes. But these are ultimately unconscious survival responses, not deliberate machinations.
Well, let's start by looking at what's actually happening on the surface, because the surface is deeply deceptive. When most people hear the word narcissist, they picture the grandiose type.
The loud ones.
Right. The CEO demanding the spotlight, the person making loud public gestures, bragging constantly. But vulnerable narcissists operate in the shadows. They use their introversion and their apparent low self-esteem as a covert tool of control.
Yeah, they really do.
They actually abandon themselves in public to appear shy, anxious, or humble, while actively manipulating the intimate one-on-one settings behind closed doors. They draw you in with self-deprecation.
They do. It's highly disarming.
Exactly. It disarms your defenses. But the moment they face criticism, what psychologists call a narcissistic injury, that fragile facade drops instantly. It triggers a highly predictable behavioral sequence.
The shift is jarring.
It's whiplash. You see explosive rage, or worse, this freezing passive-aggressive withdrawal. And I want to be clear about the function of that rage. It is intentional. It acts to silence the critic, induce immediate guilt, and restore their position of superiority. The insecurity itself isn't a symptom. It functions as a weapon.
I hear your behavioral breakdown, and the sequence you're describing is incredibly accurate to the lived experience of the partner. But I have to push back on the idea that it is a conscious, intentional system of control.
You don't think it's intentional?
No, that perspective, honestly, it grants the covert narcissist far too much credit for self-awareness. We really have to look beneath that mask. Vulnerable narcissism is built on an incredibly unstable psychological foundation.
Okay.
In therapy, we often trace this back to early childhood trauma that results in what we call severe emotional deprivation schemas.
Let's unpack that for the listener. What does an emotional deprivation schema actually look like in practice?
Imagine being a young child and slowly realizing that there is no emotional floor beneath you. The caregivers who were supposed to validate your reality simply didn't, or they punished you for having needs.
Wow.
Right? So to survive that void, the child builds a fragile, self-focused scaffold. They have to believe they are secretly special just to endure the neglect.
Ah, I see.
So flash forward to adulthood. When they receive even mild criticism from a partner, It isn't just a critique of their behavior. It is an involuntary identity trigger. Their entire fragile ego is threatened.
So they snap.
They experience a catastrophic internal collapse. What you are calling a calculated weapon, psychologists call humiliated fury. It's a frantic, desperate defense mechanism to avoid psychic annihilation.
I see why you frame it as a survival reflex. But let me give you a different perspective on the nature of this rage, because we have to look at the immediate aftermath. Let's look at the frustration-aggression hypothesis.
Okay.
The covert narcissist harbors a grandiose false self, even if they hide it behind a victim complex. They feel entitled to endless admiration and compliance, what we call narcissistic supply.
Right, the supply.
When they are frustrated by a lack of that supply, they erupt. But notice what happens next. Notice how they use the rage. It isn't just a random emotional breakdown where they curl into a ball. The rage is used offensively.
It is very directed.
Yes, it acts as a trailer, a preview of the psychological or even physical violence that will occur if the victim persists in holding them accountable. It's an aggressive boundary being drawn to condition the partner.
The conditioning happens, absolutely. The partner learns to walk on eggshells.
Right. And here is where I struggle with the theory of uncontrollable dysregulation. If this rage is purely an involuntary survival panic, a catastrophic internal collapse, as you put it, how do you explain the saccharine sentimentality,
You mean the apologies?
the perfectly calculated submissiveness that so often immediately follows the rage? When the narcissist realizes the partner is packing a bag, the rage vanishes. Suddenly they are weeping, apologizing, promising the world.
Yes, the 180-degree turn.
If they are so out of control, how do they suddenly calibrate their behavior so perfectly to trap the victim back in the cycle?
That is a completely fair question, and it's one that keeps so many victims trapped in self-doubt. But let's look at the psychological mechanism of splitting.
Splitting.
Yeah. What you see as a calculated Machiavellian pivot to keep the victim trapped, I see as the sheer terror of abandonment overriding the system. It is not a master plan.
Okay, walk me through that.
When the narcissist rages, they are splitting. They lack object constancy, meaning they view the partner as all bad in that moment. You aren't their loving wife or husband. You are a persecutor who has caused them a narcissistic injury.
They literally can't remember the good times in that moment.
Exactly. You are entirely the enemy. But when they realize you might actually walk out the door, the terror of profound isolation kicks in. They frantically attempt to repair the narcissistic scar.
By flipping the script?
They flip the switch, now seeing you as the all-good savior, hence the weeping and the saccharine sentimentality. And I think if you're listening to this right now and thinking, wait, my partner is super sensitive to rejection, are they a covert narcissist? We have to make a crucial distinction here.
That distinction is vital. Let's make sure we clarify that.
Right. We have to distinguish between rejection-sensitive dysphoria, or RSD, and vulnerable narcissism. With RSD, which we often see in neurodivergent individuals like those with ADHD, the person has a shame-based, other-oriented fear.
So it's about the other person.
Yes, they are genuinely terrified of disappointing the people they love. Criticism physically hurts them because they care so deeply about the connection.
But vulnerable narcissism is different.
Totally different. It is a fragile, self-oriented fear protected by a wall of hidden entitlement. They aren't afraid of disappointing you. They are terrified that their secret superiority is being disproven.
Wow.
So when they flip from rage to extreme affection, they are frantically trying to stabilize their own reality. Now, you are right about the effect the victim experiences this rapid shift as intermittent reinforcement.
The slot machine effect.
Yes. The highest highs and the lowest lows. It creates a deep chemical trauma bond. The victim's nervous system becomes addicted to the relief of the narcissist's apology.
But you're saying the motive isn't intentional.
Right. The narcissist's rapid behavioral shift is driven by their own structural instability, not a conscious plot to manufacture that trauma bond.
That's an interesting point, and the distinction between fearing you've disappointed someone versus fearing your superiority is exposed, well, it's a brilliant way to understand the underlying motive.
Thank you.
Though I would still frame the execution differently. Because explosive rage takes a lot of energy, right? A narcissist cannot sustain a screaming match 24/7. So what happens when that overt rage goes underground?
Ah, the covert tactics.
Precisely. Let's pivot to the pernicious, passive-aggressive variant of this behavior, which I argue reveals the invisible manipulation system even more clearly. Vulnerable narcissists don't always explode. Often, they utilize sulking, the silent treatment, and covert smear campaigns.
Which are devastating.
But these aren't momentary panics. These are long-term conditioning tactics. Let's go back to our Friday night example.
Okay.
The partner says, "Hey, could you help with the dishes?" The narcissist sighs, looks at the floor, mutters something about how they can never do anything right, and then doesn't speak to the partner for 3 days.
Right. Playing the victim.
By constantly withdrawing and playing the victim, the narcissist forces the partner into a state of chronic hypervigilance. The partner starts preemptively changing their own behavior to soothe the narcissist before the mood even drops.
The empathy trap.
The empathy trap. They exploit the victim's natural compassion. You don't sustain a years-long silent treatment or a subtle campaign to isolate your partner from their friends out of a momentary primitive defense mechanism.
You think it takes planning?
That requires a sustained, systematic approach to narrative control. It requires keeping a mental ledger of who has the power.
Well, I agree that the silent treatment and passive aggression are incredibly destructive, and they absolutely alter the power dynamic in the home. But let's analyze this through the lens of primitive defense mechanisms, specifically projection and projective identification.
Let's do it. We need to unpack those terms.
We do, because they are the engine of this behavior. The vulnerable narcissist is walking around carrying an internal landscape of intense shame, envy, and inadequacy.
Which they hide.
Yes, it is intolerable to their conscious minds. They cannot sit on the couch and say, "I feel worthless today." So what do? They unconsciously project it. They accuse you of being the one who is hypercritical or unloving.
Okay, so that's projection.
But projective identification takes it a step further. And this is where it gets incredibly dark for the victim.
How so?
Think of it like someone carrying a heavy, leaking backpack of toxic waste. They can't bear the weight of it. With projective identification, they don't just blame you for the waste. They interact with you in such a maddening, passive-aggressive way that you actually begin to experience their intolerable emotions.
Wait, really?
Yes. They provoke you with the silent treatment until you finally snap and yell. And the moment you yell, they sit back and say, "See, you are the abusive one. You are the unstable one."
Oh, wow. So they subtly provoke the victim until the victim literally embodies the narcissist's own self-loathing and instability.
Exactly. The narcissist uses sulking not as a calculated military tactic, but to force the partner to become the emotional container for their own unbearable pain. The victim ends up feeling crazy, guilty, and full of self-doubt.
Which is exactly how the narcissist feels inside.
Exactly. Which is the exact state the narcissist is desperately trying to escape. The reality distortion and the gaslighting that the victim experiences are the tragic results of this psychological outsourcing. They aren't thinking, "I will now erode my partner's sanity to gain leverage."
Right.
They are thinking, "I feel terrible, it must be your fault, and I will make you feel this so I can feel momentarily cleansed."
I see the mechanics of the toxic backpack, and it's a powerful visual. But I'm not entirely convinced by that line of reasoning, because it ignores the fundamental issue of the grandiosity gap and how vulnerable narcissists extract what we call narcissistic supply.
The envy aspect.
Yes. Vulnerable narcissists are deeply envious. They constantly compare themselves to others and cannot handle anyone else's success, even, and sometimes especially, their own partner's success.
That envy is a hallmark trait, for sure.
Right, so when they exploit their partners, they are consciously filling a void. Their default to blaming others and refusing accountability is a deliberate cognitive distortion designed to maintain total control of the relationship narrative. I've often thought of it like a parasitic financial transaction. They use compliments, vulnerability, and self-deprecation as a currency to buy your trust and your empathy,
only to completely bankrupt your self-esteem when their own hidden superiority is threatened.
That's a strong comparison.
They drain the victim's emotional resources to inflate their own status. That level of systematic exploitation, day in and day out, requires a self-serving awareness.
Oh, I think your analogy of the parasitic financial transaction is actually a brilliant way to describe the dynamic. It perfectly captures how the victim feels, bankrupted.
Exactly.
But I completely reframe the motive.
Okay, how do you see the motive?
The narcissist is indeed attempting to survive the grandiosity gap. And for the listeners, the grandiosity gap is that agonizing distance between their secretly inflated self-image, the unrecognized genius, the perfect martyr, and their actual, often unremarkable reality.
Right, the gap between the fantasy and reality.
It is a painful place to live, but they require this constant external validation, this supply, to stave off a literal depressive collapse. They aren't hoarding emotional currency to be malicious. They are starving.
But the result is the same for the victim.
The result is entirely the same. The victim's experience of being emotionally depleted is very real. But it happens because the narcissist is fundamentally empty. They use a mechanism called introjection.
Which means,
Let's apply the explain like I'm five rule here. Think of introjection like an emotional vacuum. They are so devoid of an internal sense of self that they literally try to absorb the victim's traits, their confidence, their warmth, their vitality, their social grace, just to feel whole for a day.
Just to function.
Right. It's parasitic, yes, but it's the parasiticism of a psychological void, a black hole, not an evil mastermind rubbing their hands together in the dark.
But let me push back here. If we strip away the language of intention, if we stop calling it a manipulation system and only look at it as a void trying to survive, we risk minimizing the reality of the abuse for the victim.
I certainly don't want to minimize the abuse.
Right, but when we profile this behavior from a forensic standpoint, we see a very clear sequence over and over again. Trigger, manipulation, victim confusion, guilt, compliance, and finally, control restoration.
The cycle.
Yes.
Whether they admit it to themselves in a mirror or not, the vulnerable narcissist learns from experience. They learn that playing the victim yields compliance. They learn that the silent treatment yields apologies from a partner who did absolutely nothing wrong.
The reward mechanism is highly reinforcing, I'll give you that.
Exactly. The reward mechanism is control. And over time, this manipulation becomes entirely invisible to the outside world. To the public, the narcissist just looks depressed, shy, or maybe socially anxious. They get sympathy from everyone.
While the partner suffers alone?
Only the intimate partner sees the intense jealousy, the shifting goalposts, the subtle devaluations, and the absolute refusal to take accountability. And that is precisely why understanding the difference between grandiose and vulnerable narcissism is so critical for public awareness. A grandiose narcissist will explode publicly. They leave a very visible trail of destruction.
Oh, definitely.
But a vulnerable narcissist will use withdrawal and self-deprecation as a defense, making it almost impossible for outsiders to hold them accountable. The victim looks like the aggressor because the narcissist has so effectively occupied the role of the wounded party.
Right.
If the victim snaps and yells, the narcissist can point and say, "Look how I'm being treated."
it's the perfect crime, emotionally speaking.
It is. But I maintain that understanding the deep-seated psychological fragility, the early childhood schemas, the primitive defenses like splitting and projective identification, is essential for the victim's recovery.
Why is that essential for the victim?
Because it explains why the cycle of abuse is so rigid and impenetrable. If it were just a conscious, rational strategy, it could be unlearned. You could sit down at the kitchen table, negotiate with them, point out their behavior, and they would adjust.
But they never do.
No, because it is a survival mechanism wired into their deepest ego defense. It is highly resistant to therapy or change. You can't outlove a defense mechanism.
Which brings us to perhaps the most crucial part of this discussion, what the listener, potentially the victim, takes away from this reality. We are synthesizing two incredibly complex views here.
We are.
I maintain that viewing vulnerable narcissism as a system of covert control is absolutely essential for victims. It allows them to clearly map the power dynamics at play in their own homes.
To see the reality.
Yes.
When you realize that someone's insecurity and their depression are actually the leash they are using to guide your behavior, you can finally stop falling into the empathy trap. You stop trying to fix a sadness that is actually a weapon.
And I strongly agree that the empathy trap is where victims get stuck for decades. But from the therapeutic side, understanding the trauma and the primitive defenses allows the victim to truly depersonalize the abuse.
How so?
When you realize that their humiliated fury and their reality distortion are just desperate projections of their own internal emptiness, when you see the toxic backpack for what it is, you stop believing the terrible things they say about you. You realize you are just a prop in their internal psychodrama.
You aren't the cause of their misery. You're just the closest target.
Precisely. But on the ultimate outcome, we find profound convergence. Regardless of whether the behavior is a calculated behavioral algorithm or an unconscious, primitive defense mechanism, the impact on the victim's nervous system is identical.
It really is.
Profound reality distortion, emotional dependency, chronic hypervigilance, and deep, lasting trauma.
The impact is undeniable. And the source material we are referencing is very clear on actionable protection strategies. First and foremost is the necessity of establishing firm, unwavering boundaries.
Absolutely.
Because vulnerable narcissists operate like that emotional vacuum, taking as much as you give without ever offering anything reciprocal in return. Boundaries are your only shield. But more importantly, and this addresses the empathy trap directly, you must resist the urge to soothe the narcissist's ego. You have to allow them to sit in their own discomfort.
Which is incredibly difficult for an empathetic partner to do.
It goes against every instinct a loving partner has. When they sulk or play the victim, your instinct is to rush in and fix it. But trying to fix it for them only reinforces the conditioning cycle. You are handing them the control they are silently demanding.
Which is why the final strategy is perhaps the most critical of all. You must seek an unbiased outside perspective.
Yes.
A trauma-informed therapist or a deeply trusted outsider can help break the conditioning, because the vulnerable narcissist isolates you through their selective introversion. They don't want to go out, they don't like your friends, they eventually control your entire reality.
The isolation is key to the control.
Right. An outside perspective is the only thing that shatters that localized reality distortion field. You need someone to say, no, what happened on Friday night wasn't normal, and it wasn't your fault.
We began today by looking at the predator hiding behind the mask of fragility. The human psyche's capacity to conceal profound grandiosity and entitlement behind a veil of vulnerability, shyness, and self-doubt is a complex, often chilling mystery.
It is.
It requires constant vigilance to navigate, and it challenges everything we think we know about how power operates in intimate spaces.
It really does. It leaves us having to constantly evaluate the true motives behind the mask, understanding that sometimes extreme sensitivity isn't a call for help. Sometimes it is actually the most impenetrable armor of all.
Thank you for joining us on The Debate. Keep questioning the dynamics around you. Protect your empathy and remember that sometimes the most controlling force in the room is the one claiming to be powerless.